Okay, so now we're going to build the override that powers this pricing component. We've got a couple of different overrides going on here. We've got one that toggles the period, and then we have an override for each price, and then we have an override that displays the current period. Okay, so in our file, you can see that we've got our pricing page set up, and at the top here, we have the period switch, which is a component. We click into that, you can see that it's got two variants, one for monthly and one for annual. But you'll notice that we have no interactions between the two because we're going to handle this variant change in our code override. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is go ahead and create a new override. We're going to create a new file and we're going to call it pricing. And then much like before, we're going to remove a lot of the defaults and just leave one. So let's remove this random color import. Let's remove that. Let's remove all of this stuff. And let's hit save. And let's just think a little bit about what overrides we're going to need. We're going to need one that toggles the period. We're going to need one to display each tier's pricing. And then we're going to need one to display the period. So we hop back into this file. Let's just call this one with toggle period. And this will be the one that actually triggers the period change. And then let's go ahead and duplicate this. Let's call this one with basic price. And then we want another one that's going to be with premium price, and then another one that is with enterprise price. And then lastly, we need one to display the period. So we're just going to call this one with period. Okay, so if we hit save and we go back to our pricing component, we're just going to apply these overrides. We're going to select our toggle and we're going to say pricing with toggle period. We're going to select each of these pieces of text where it says month. And I'm going to go down and select pricing. And let's say with period. And then for the actual prices themselves, let's just select all of them, scroll down and say pricing, select basic price. And now when I select this one, it's much easier to just switch the override. So select that one and we'll make that enterprise price. And again, if we just preview this and go straight back, now when we go edit these overrides, we can preview the final component side by side. Okay, so that's all set up. The first thing we need to do is build our store. So instead of background here, we're going to say period, and we're going to give it a default value of month. And before we carry on, I actually just want to build out this toggle period override so that we can get the change from month to year working. So to toggle the period, we actually need to know what the current period is because we want the opposite of that. So we've already got our store value over here. And what we want to do is create a variable called new period, and it's going to check the value of the current period. So we'll go store.period, and we're going to check if that is equal to month. And if it is, we're going to return year. Otherwise, we'll return month. And then on this component, we just want to write an onClick handler. So onClick equals, we're going to pass it a function, and that function will in turn call setStore. And then we're going to set the new value of period. So we're going to say period, new period. Okay, so now every time someone clicks this component, it'll change the period to be sort of the opposite of the current period. But when I click this, nothing is happening. That's because we haven't set up the variant change yet. But to make sure this is working, what we can do is we can just log the current value of the store. So if we just write console.log and store.period, and then to check the value of the console, we can just open up the console down here. And now when I click on this, we should see some feedback here. So every time I click on it, it's changing, which means it's working. So now we just need to make sure that this variant transition fires off every time we click it. So let's get rid of this console.log. Now we can't just pass in variant equals new period, because if we go back to our component, you'll see that the variant names are monthly and annual, which don't quite match the store names we've got. Now we could just change this to be month and year, but I really don't like having lowercase variant names for some reason, so I'm just going to write a little bit of code that'll fix this. So what we're going to do over here is basically just duplicate this line. We're going to call this variable variant, and then we're going to say if store.period equals month, return monthly, otherwise return annual. And notice how we're doing it sort of the opposite way to this line because we're selecting the variant this time. So now we can just pass variant into here, and when I click on this, we can see the transition. But of course we want this period change to be reflected in these pieces of text. So to do that, let's update our with period override. And in this case, it's fairly easy. We can just say text equals store.period. So now when we toggle this, the period changes, but you'll see that we're missing the /. So what we have to do is actually add that prefix into our text. So we need to wrap this in some backticks. We'll put one before and one afterwards. And the backticks just allow us to construct this string. So now we can say / and then add a space. And then to access our variable here, we need to do a $sign and a bracket, and then we need to close that bracket on the other side. And there we go. Now when we change this, everything looks as it should. Okay, so now we need to add the prices for each tier to our store. And up until now, we've used pretty simple values for the store. But in this case, we're going to create a list of prices, not just a single value. So what we're going to do is write a new entry called prices. And this is going to be an object. And each key in the object will be a different tier. So we'll have one for basic and some value, and one for premium and some value, and one for enterprise and some value. And then inside each of these tiers, we want to actually have two prices because we have a monthly and an annual price. So we're going to make a list, an array, and inside of here, we're going to have the prices. So the first price will be the monthly price, and that's going to be $24. And the second price will be the annual price, which will be $249. Notice here that I haven't made these numbers. I've actually just made them strings that include the dollar symbol. You don't have to do it this way. You could make them numbers and then add the dollar symbol in the same way we added this / over here to the period. It's really just a matter of personal preference. You could construct this whole thing a little bit differently. So instead of each tier being a list of prices, you could have another object in here. So we could say object, and each tier could be a key in that object. So we'd say month, and then we'd have the price in here, and then another key for annual and the price in here. And actually this approach is a little bit easier to access. So to display the basic price, we have to do something like this. We have to write const index, and then we need to figure out what the current value of store.period is. If it is month, then we want to return 0. And if it is anything else, we want to return 1. And then to display the price, we need to go text equals store.prices.basic, and then pass in the index. Of course, I spelled prices wrong here, so let's just fix that. Okay, and now you can see that when I change the period, the price changes. But it's a little bit easier to access this object version. So instead, what I can do is say text equals store.prices.premium, and then pass in the current value of period. And really this is just a matter of preference. I kind of prefer not having to write this line over here, but you might find that that's more readable than this down here. So all that's left to do is just pick a direction and roll this out for each price. So I'm going to go with this approach. What I'm going to do is just copy this in for each tier and then update the pricing. And now everything works perfectly. If we make this a little bit wider, it'll display a little bit better. But yeah, that looks great. So that's pretty much it for this pricing override. But you might be thinking, I could have just done this with a component. And you'd be right. You only need 2 variants really to make this whole thing into a component. The main advantage of using a code override is that anytime you want to display your price, you can just use the override. And then if your price changes, you can just go into the override to change it, and everywhere will update. But the next example we're going to make is something you couldn't easily make with a component. So on the right here, we have a product list that scrolls, and on the left, we have a fixed sidebar. And at the bottom here, we have some icons that toggle the list view. What makes this difficult to achieve with just the component is the toggle over here is nowhere near the actual list in the hierarchy. In fact, it's in a completely separate part of the UI. Okay, so let's look how this is all set up. So on the left here, we have a fixed or sticky sidebar, and at the bottom, we have these 2 feather icons. The grid one has a code override set on it called with set grid, and the list one has one called with set list. On the right, we have the product list, and each one of these product components has an override called with view change. If I click into this product component, you can see that it's got a variant called grid and a variant called list. So just like in some of the previous examples, we're going to use a code override to toggle the variant change of this component. The only difference is we're doing it from an entirely separate part of the UI. So you can see I've got the 3 blank overrides set up, and then in our store we have a mode, and the values of that will be grid or list, which match the variant names of our component. And this setup makes this override very easy. So we're just going to take the same approach we've taken with the last few overrides. First up, let's handle the with view change override, which will change the variant. And that's going to be as simple as saying variant equals store.mode. So if we hit save, nothing should happen. And then if we type list in here, we should get the lists. Now, obviously this screen is a little bit too narrow to be laid out correctly, but you get the idea. So now we just need to fill out these two overrides with set grid and with set list. And the way to do that is obviously to go on click and pass in a function. And that function will call set store. And we're going to say mode equals grid. And we're going to do the exact same thing for this override, except we're going to change this value to list. So now when I hit one of these, it should toggle between the two states. If I make it a bit wider, you can see it a little bit better, but that's how the transition should work. The last thing I want to do is change the color of these icons depending on which state is active. So in theory, I should be able to write style equals open brackets and then write something like color and then set the color based on the value of the store. So store.mode equals grid. For now, we're just going to use a wild color like red. And if it's not active, we want a color like yellow. But you'll notice that there is no change. That basically had no effect. And the reason for that is this feather icon is actually a component, which means we don't have access to its internal styling. Back on our main page, we can see that the feather icon actually has a bunch of variables we pass into it. And the one we want is called color. So instead of setting the style, we want to pass down a new property called color. And then we can remove this color over here, and we can remove one of these curly brackets. And now you can see that that is taking effect. So whenever you want to specify a new variable value for a component, this is how you pass in that value. So instead of red and yellow here, I'm just going to make it black if it's active and 60% of black if it's inactive. So if I press save now, you can see that when it's inactive, it's sort of 60% opaque, and when it's active, it's black. And then let's just duplicate this for over here. We'll change this to be list. Press save, and now it works as intended. When we toggle between them, one becomes active, the other becomes inactive. Okay, and that's it for using the store. In the next video, we're moving on to how to display dynamic content using code overrides. And the first override we're going to make is one that displays the local time and one that displays the local weather. So I'll catch you in the next video.